The crowd stood silent at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Not a whisper, not a breath disturbed the air until one entitled kid decided to laugh, mock, and even step past the sacred ropes. Tourists froze in disbelief, but when the guards' rifle slammed against the marble and his voice thundered through the cemetery, what happened next left everyone speechless. The air at Arlington National Cemetery felt different, almost heavy, as if the weight of history itself pressed down upon every visitor who stepped through its gates. Rows of white marble headstones stretched endlessly across the green hills, each one a silent reminder of sacrifice, of lives given without hesitation and without return. Yet, for all the graves that bore names, there were some that carried none, and at the heart of it all stood the tomb of the unknown soldier, a shrine that honored the faceless, the nameless, the countless who had vanished into the fog of war and never found their way home. Here, silence was not a rule, it was a duty. Every footstep slowed, every whisper died in the air, and even children instinctively softened their voices as if something unseen commanded reverence. The tomb guards, known as sentinels, carried out their sacred task with precision so perfect it seemed almost inhuman. Step by step, they marched in an unbroken rhythm. 21 paces down the black mat, 21 seconds of silence, then 21 paces back again. Their uniforms shone with impossible sharpness, their rifles gleamed, and their faces betrayed nothing. They did not guard the tomb for show, nor for applause. They guarded it because honor demanded it, and a crowd knew this. Mothers held their children's hands tighter, veterans stood a little straighter, and tourists lowered their cameras after just one picture, letting the moment live in their hearts instead. But not everyone in the crowd shared that same respect. Near the front rope stood a man in expensive sunglasses, scrolling lazily on his phone, more absorbed in his notifications than the sacred ground he stood on. Beside him was his teenage son, maybe 15, slouched with arms crossed, his eyes darting around with boredom. The boy yawned, dragged his sneakers against the pavement, and rolled his eyes at the measured march of the guard. To him, this wasn't sacred history, it was just another stop on a family trip. Another thing his father insisted on seeing before they went back to their hotel pool. He didn't feel the weight of silence pressing on him. He didn't notice the reverence in the faces around him. He didn't see the tears quietly streaming down the cheeks of a mother, clutching a photo of her son. To him, it was just another performance, another uniformed man walking back and forth for no reason he could understand. The boy glanced at his father, waiting for approval to complain or to leave. But his father barely looked up from his phone, muttering a distracted just, "Wait, it'll be over soon." And so the boy stayed restless, shifting, searching for something to amuse himself in a place where silence and respect left no room for entertainment. The silence at the tomb lingered like a prayer, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic clicks of the guards' boots against the marble. Each strike echoed with precision, carrying the weight of countless fallen souls. The crowd stood still, some with hands over their hearts, others simply staring, lost in thought. But from the front row came a sound that shattered the reverence like glass, the snicker of a teenage boy who could no longer contain his mockery. He leaned toward his father, his voice dripping with arrogance as he whispered loud enough for those around to hear, "Look, Dad, he walks like a robot." His laughter burst out, raw and careless, cutting through the sacred silence. Heads turned, sharply. A mother clutched her child closer. A veteran's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists on the arms of his wheelchair. The guard, still marching with iron discipline, gave no sign he had heard, but the air shifted. The sanctity of the moment had been broken. The boy, emboldened by the attention, smirked and clapped mockingly, the sound echoing in the solemn space like an insult. Some in the crowd gasped. Others looked down in shame, unwilling to witness such blatant disrespect. Yet the father, instead of correcting his son, glanced up from his phone with a faint smirk, a silent approval that told the boy his behavior was clever, even bold, encouraged. The teenager stepped forward, crossing the rope barrier that marked the sacred ground, a line no one dared to cross. The crowd inhaled sharply, a collective gasp of disbelief that seemed to freeze the air. He stood there, 1 foot past the boundary, grinning, mocking the guard's rigid march. "Hey, does he even blink?" he sneered, his voice louder now, as if demanding to be heard. Around him, tourists exchanged glances of outrage. A woman shook her head in disgust. An elderly man muttered, "Unbelievable." But no one moved, bound by the unspoken rule that the guard's duty was not theirs to interrupt. The guard's steps continued, flawless, measured, as though the boy's taunts were nothing but noise. Yet every person in the crowd felt the tension, coiled tighter with each second, knowing the sentinel was not a man easily provoked, but one sworn to defend the honor of the tomb. At any cost. The boy's grin widened, mistaking silence for weakness, not realizing he was moments away from a reckoning. His arrogance filled the air where respect once lived, poisoning the stillness with mockery. The father folded his arms, smirking like a man who believed rules didn't apply to him or his family, blind to the storm that was about to break. What began as a childish laugh had grown into open defiance, and now all eyes waited for the guard to respond. The boy's laughter still lingered in the air, when suddenly the sentinel halted mid-step, his gleaming shoes striking the black mat, with a force that made the crowd jump. For the first time since the mockery began, the guard moved outside his flawless rhythm. In one swift motion, he shifted his weight and slammed the butt of his rifle against the marble, the sound exploding, like a crack of thunder across the cemetery. Every head snapped toward him, the sharp echo rolling over the rows of white headstones as if even the dead demanded silence. The boy's grin faltered, his confidence shaken by the sheer power of that single sound. But before he could speak, the guard's voice erupted, booming with the strength of generations. "It is requested that everyone maintain silence and respect at the tomb of the unknown soldier." His words weren't just a command, they were a judgment. A reminder that this place was not entertainment, not a stage, but hallowed ground, sanctified by blood. The sound of his voice cut through the boy's arrogance like a blade, reverberating in the chest of every person present. Parents who moments earlier had shaken their heads now stood straighter. Veterans saluted with tears brimming in their eyes, and even children went perfectly still, sensing they had witnessed something greater than discipline. It was honor itself, embodied in a single man's stance. The teenager froze, his face flushed crimson, his smirk gone as quickly as it had come. He glanced at his father for support, but the man, once smirking in pride, now looked uneasy, his sunglasses unable to hide the discomfort that had spread across his features. The silence that followed was unlike the silence before. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, suffocating, as if the guard's command had pulled a curtain over the crowd and left them standing in the weight of shame. Nobody moved, nobody dared breathe too loudly. Even the wind seemed to pause out of respect. The boy shuffled back behind the rope, his head lowered, the spark of arrogance in his eyes dimmed by the piercing authority of the guard's presence. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had stopped, as though the entire cemetery had turned to bear witness to this single exchange between duty and disrespect. The sentinel did not waver. His posture remained unbreakable, his jaw set, his eyes fixed forward. He had not scolded the boy for himself, but for the tomb, for the honor of the countless unknowns who rested beneath its stone. Slowly, as if nothing had happened, he resumed his march, every step deliberate, every turn flawless, his rhythm restored. Yet the air was different now. The crowd's respect had deepened, and the boy's careless laughter had been replaced with a silence so absolute it felt like an apology. What the guard had given was not just a warning. It was a lesson, one delivered without anger, without cruelty, but with the unshakable authority of a man sworn to protect something greater than himself. The boy stood frozen behind the rope, his cheeks burning, but the silence that followed the guard's booming command was not enough to quiet the storm inside him, still clinging to his pride. He muttered under his breath, loud enough for a few nearby to hear, "It's just a soldier." Acting tough, the words, though softer than before, spread like a ripple through the crowd, stirring disbelief and disappointment in every pair of eyes that turned his way. But before the sentinel could react again, another voice rose from the gathering steady, aged, and carrying a weight far heavier than anger. An elderly man, seated in a wheelchair near the back, adjusted the brim of his faded cap, the one stitched, with the words Vietnam veteran. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silence of that sacred place, it carried clear as a bell. That soldier, he began, his eyes fixed on the boy, is guarding more than marble. He's guarding my brothers. Men who went where I went, fought beside me, but never made it home. The crowd shifted, every gaze now drawn to the veteran whose hands trembled slightly on the arms of his chair. He paused, his throat tight, before, continuing, "You see, some of us came back in boxes, and some of us never came back at all. This tomb is for them, for the families who never got to lay a hand on a grave, never got to whisper goodbye, never got to bring flowers to the ones they lost. For them, this stone is all they have." His words hung in the air like scripture, every syllable soaked in pain and reverence. The tourists who moments ago had been merely spectators now stood transformed, tears welled in eyes, lips pressed tight to hold back sobs, and even children clutched their parents' hands more tightly. The boy, who had mocked and laughed, suddenly found it impossible to meet the old man's gaze. His bravado cracked like fragile glass, and for the first time, he looked around at the sea of faces, every one of them radiating reverence for a sacrifice he had never understood. The father, who had once smirked with approval, now lowered his sunglasses. Shame etched across his expression as the reality of the moment struck him harder than any reprimand could. The guard, still resuming his perfect march, never faltered, but his very presence underscored the veteran's words, a living symbol of honor. That required no defense because respect spoke for itself. The silence after the old man's story was deeper than any before, as if even the air bowed its head in mourning, and in that silence, the boy finally understood that what he had mocked was not a performance but a promise that no unknown soldier would ever be forgotten. The boy's chest felt heavy as the veteran's words sank deep into him, heavier than the weight of all the stairs that pinned him in place. His laughter, his arrogance, his careless words, all of it suddenly seemed so small, so shameful in the shadow of the tomb. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. As he dared a glance toward the guard once more, the sentinel's face remained carved in stone, his eyes locked forward, his rifle glinting in the sunlight with the same unwavering precision as before. Yet somehow, the boy no longer saw just a soldier pacing with rehearsed movements. He saw every name without a grave, every family left waiting for a son who never returned, every sacrifice etched into the silence of the marble. His father shifted beside him, guilt flickering across his features as though the veteran's words had exposed a truth he had long ignored. Slowly, without being asked, the man removed his cap, lowering his head in respect. And after a moment's hesitation, the boy followed, bowing his head not out of fear but out of something he had never felt before, reverence. Around them, the crowd remained silent, a stillness so pure it felt sacred, as if the unknown soldiers themselves stood among them, demanding acknowledgement. The boy's eyes burned, though he fought to hold back tears, realizing that his careless mockery had nearly desecrated a place built on the blood of the brave. The old veteran in the wheelchair gave him a faint nod, not of anger, but of understanding, as though he recognized the boy's heart had shifted in those moments. That respect had been planted where ignorance once lived. The guard struck the marble once more, the sharp crack echoing across the cemetery, and resumed his perfect march, his shoes clicking with timeless rhythm, each step a reminder that honor does not bend, does not break, does not yield to arrogance. And though no words were spoken, the message was clear. Respect is not requested, it is commanded by sacrifice. The crowd began to drift away in quiet reverence, their whispers hushed, their steps slow, as if none dared disturb the sanctity of what they had witnessed. But the boy lingered a moment longer, staring at the tomb, the air heavy in his lungs. And in that silence, he made himself a promise that he would never again take freedom for granted, nor laugh at those who stood to protect it. The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder, but this time there was no smugness, no pride in arrogance. Only humility, as both of them walked away different men than when they arrived. And though the guard would never break formation, never glance their way, the lesson he delivered, echoed by the voice of a veteran, would remain forever etched in their memory, a silent vow carved not in stone but in the human heart, to always honor the unknown, because in their silence lies the price of every freedom we hold.